Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Mastering Working and Managing Your Career Remotely. My name is John Sudekum, and I'll be your moderator today, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. I'm joined today by Paul Farnsworth, who is the Chief Technology Officer here at DEHI Group, which is the parent company for DICE. I'm also joined by Nick Kolakowski, who is a Senior Editor and brings years of tech experience with him. Okay, so here's our plan for today. We're going to start off by discussing the status of tech hiring amidst COVID-19. Then we'll talk about methods to successfully work remotely. Then we'll shift to interviewing and onboarding remotely. And we'll save time for questions at the end of the webinar, so please use the control panel to submit yours. And one last thing before we get going. For those of you that don't know DICE, we make it easier for tech professionals to find their next career opportunity. We are tech specialists, so we help connect the right professional with the right employer for the right job. Okay, now let's jump into it. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to DICE Senior Editor, Nick Kolakowski.
Thanks, John. And hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. We're living through some interesting times, to put it mildly. COVID-19 has introduced a lot of turbulence into the market. However, not everything is dark. Our recent analysis, including a parsing of data from Burning Glass Technologies, shows that employers continue to see all kinds of technologists for key roles within their organizations. As you can see from the chart on the screen, the number of total job postings by month in the US stayed relatively level between February and March. This is good news for technologists out there, especially those who might be seeking a new job. It's also clear from the data that technologists who have mastered a variety of skills are very much in demand by employers. These companies want technologists whose job it is to support, build, and defend company tech infrastructure, including cybersecurity specialists and database administrators. As you can see, here are some of the top jobs, along with the percentage change between February and March. Cybersecurity, systems engineers, database administrators, systems administrators, and DevOps engineers are all clearly in the sights of employers everywhere. However, not all jobs are on the rise. As you can see here, some jobs have been less in demand, including graphic designers and business analysts. What can we conclude from that? Companies are seeking to build out their infrastructure at the moment, or shift their back-end operations to account for a new COVID-19 driven strategy. Hence, the need for cybersecurity people, database people, sysadmins, and others along those lines. Fortunately, we're also seeing strong job posting growth across a number of different cities in the US, from major tech hubs such as Arlington, Virginia, home of Amazon's upcoming HQ2 and many federal contractors, to up-and-coming cities such as San Diego and St. Louis. That's great news, because it means that demand is beyond Silicon Valley and New York City and relatively evenly distributed throughout the US. On DICE, here are some of the top positions at the moment. As you can see, there's a lot of variety here when it comes to skill sets and positions. In this new environment, companies need technologists more than ever to keep things running. So first, we'll tackle working effectively while remote. When working remotely, technologists face different challenges than other types of employees, as I'm sure many people on this webinar are aware. Before the COVID-19 crisis began, the DICE salary report revealed that 93% of technologists wanted to work from home, but only 60% had the chance to do so. Well, after the events of the last month and a half or so, that certainly changed. Now we can assume that the vast majority of technologists are working from home. And there are big benefits to working from home, such as a drastically shortened commute. For example, mine is about 20 feet, but there are also some downsides. Those who have never really worked from home for a sustained period might be surprised to find that it can lead to loneliness, a struggle to stay motivated, and other issues. Fortunately, these are all issues that can be solved. A big first step towards achieving this right balance while working from home is to ensure that your technology stack is in place. But what does this mean? For many who have experience working from home, you probably have a home setup that works for you. However, this general shift to work from home also means that your company might have you using new apps, portals, and VPNs. It's important not to overlook whether these tools are compatible with your current home setup well before you actually need the tools. Be proactive and work with your sysadmin and other IT staff to make 100% sure everything works before you need it at the last minute. For those of you who are used to primarily working in the office, you need to stay aware that not everything will work seamlessly once you're off your company's network, even if you're bringing home your office equipment such as your work laptop. For example, many office ecosystems are primarily Windows-based, whereas many people at home have a Mac or Linux-based setup. So when you take an office app and transport it to your home network, you might have some issues that need to be worked out with your IT staff well in advance. Which brings us to the next big thing, managing bandwidth. Sometimes overlooked, but always key. It's easy to forget sometimes how seamlessly Office Broadband allows all of our apps and tools to run, even the ones that are the most intensive. When we're at home with our families, though, broadband can be at a premium. If you have kids trying to learn remotely, a spouse or partner on video calls, and anyone else binging Netflix, your network and workflow can slow down rather quickly. As a result of that, it's important to prioritize your broadband as best you can, even if that means setting an at-home schedule for when people can stream content. After all, with lockdowns in many cities, we don't have coffee shops or co-working spaces to escape to. And this brings us to another big thing, eliminating distractions. Distractions can murder your workflow. Fortunately, even minor changes can make a big difference. Invest in a good chair if you're going to be sitting for hours. Select a place away from the house's main traffic that also has good sunlight. You may also want to have your home desk mimic your office desk, including where you put certain objects and devices in order to better lock in your productivity mindset. However, sometimes you simply can't get free of distractions, especially if you're living with a lot of people in a very tight space. In those circumstances, a pair of noise-dampening headphones is key. Fortunately, a lot of technologists already have headphones to deal with noisy offices, so hopefully this is a piece of equipment that you already have on hand. Once your workplace is set up, it's time to buckle down to real work. Locking down to focus is hard enough to do in an office environment. If you're unexpectedly working from home for a long period, you're probably going to have to rediscover how to optimize that part of your routine all over again. First step, it's important to actively lock your schedule down. If your colleagues aren't sitting in the same office as you, they no longer have the same cues that you're locked down and working hard. Working from home can bring a lot of distractions from teammates and colleagues. Video calls, Slack messages, email notifications, all of these can yank your attention away. Responding to these messages can interrupt your flow. This is especially true for businesses where video calling basically becomes the main method of communication. In order to get the space and time you need, transparency and communication are key. If you voice your concerns to your manager, they can give you the cover that you need to form the schedule that you want. At a time like this, a backup plan is also very much key. What do we mean by backup plan? Essentially, it's a contingency. What happens if your broadband breaks down? If your hardware breaks down? If your app is suddenly corrupted? Make sure that the steps are in place well before you actually need them. During this period of COVID-19, also important to remember that if a coworker gets sick, you may need to have a contingency plan that covers their workload for a few weeks. Equally important is staying visible in this new environment. Remember, everyone right now is going through a pretty extreme adjustment to extended working from home. Keep calm as you and your team try to find the optimized balance between remote communication and work, as it may take a few weeks to figure everything out. And as tempting as it might be at some moments to shut down your Teams or Slack feed, and believe me, we've all been there, make sure that you leave it on. For starters, they may lessen the amount of email flooding your box, since people will be more inclined to leave you quick messages rather than sending you long and involved emails. Second, it will allow you to stay visible to your manager and teammates, even as you're working. This helps maintain a subtle, passive bond with the rest of the team. At the same time, your messaging apps are also a good tool for establishing your work-life boundaries. By displaying when you're available, away, in meetings, occupied, etc., You control the flow of potentially distracting notifications and information. A lot of offices have begun setting up virtual happy hours and other social events. These are worth attending. You'll remember how much you actually really miss your colleagues, and it really will push against the feelings of loneliness that we mentioned before. There are also bonfire meetings. Now, these aren't formal meetings, and they're not happy hours. Instead, they're a way that technologists at companies can share knowledge and best practices without the pressure of a set agenda or a problem that must immediately be solved. This is a good way for teams to share knowledge now that everybody is split apart and working remotely. Maintaining work-life balance can prove especially challenging when you're working from home all the time. A recent survey from Blind, which anonymously crowdsources technologist sentiment, gave us some pretty stark numbers about maintaining work-life balance during COVID-19. Frankly put, lots of technologists are experiencing some combination of anxiety and loneliness, combined with the feeling that their productivity isn't being maximized. Burnout has many causes. We naturally think that workload is the main one, but lack of recognition for work and lack of work-life balance are also huge factors to be considered. You may recognize the symptoms of burnout, and a lot of us have been here. We know it can have a huge impact on our lives, irrespective of what we're actually accomplishing. Lack of energy, irritability, difficulty concentrating, and negative changes in sleeping and eating patterns are big red flags. While we're all stuck at home, it's important to focus on work-life balance in order to avoid burnout, especially since some aspects of working from home can intensify some of the underlying symptoms. Routine is key. Establish a schedule. Make transparency your friend, and ensure that your team knows your schedule as well. This will help avoid people scheduling you into meetings and reaching out at inappropriate times. What's the best way to establish the schedule? Rely on the shared calendar. Most companies have one. Block it off when you're not actively on the clock. This will also allow you to respect your teammates' schedules and not try to overbook people who may already be overloaded. Maintaining your physical appearance is another big part of maintaining yourself psychologically, even though it might not seem like it. Taking care of yourself, or even making it a collective team thing, can make you feel more in control and proactive. For example, I know some developers who have started formal Fridays where they actually dress up. For many developers and engineers, working from home will make stand-ups downright weird. Many teams like in-person stand-ups, and it's easy to see why. In-person stand-ups mean that the entire team is engaged and involved. This communication loop is really tight and issues can be addressed early. If everyone is on audio and video calls, managers often feel that this sort of tight bonding is much harder to maintain. However, you can structure remote stand-ups so that you have that same kind of tight communication loop. You have to keep things active. Meetings must be structured so that everybody speaks. Just to emphasize that last point, everyone being heard and seen is a very big deal. That's how the team stays engaged, and issues are brought up in a timely way that doesn't kill projects cold. The other important thing, keeping meetings on a regular cadence no matter what. That way, it'll assume the proper amount of importance in all team members' minds. The stand-up agenda must be set well in advance, with everyone aware of the typical questions about what they're working on, what problems they're facing, and what they've already accomplished in the sprint. Goals are key, and so are short meetings, frankly. People are working extra hard from home to maintain the same productivity cadence, and they appreciate it when meetings are kept extra short. Stay aware of political issues that might arise and move to squish them well in advance. Loop up, even if it requires separate one-on-one meetings, to ensure that team members keep big picture goals in mind. Enforce time limits, but stay flexible about meeting cadence. You may need to adjust in order to accommodate everyone's new work from home schedule. Now I'm going to turn it over to Paul Farnsworth, Dice's Chief Technology Officer, to discuss how to most effectively work while remote.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. We're going to talk through how to interview while remote. So, while working remotely, preparing is the key. this may be a little different though than you might expect. I've led technology organizations for many years. I've interviewed and hired hundreds of candidates, and I think while preparing is super important, whether you're remote or you're going into an office, there are some things that have shifted. So we're going to talk through some of those. You might look at these tips and think, well, this is kind of common sense. I'm going to make a suggestion to you all. Take the tips and write them down a little bit like a checklist before a pilot would take off. And that way, as you get that nervous energy towards an interview, you can run down these and make sure that you're just remembering to prepare properly. So as Nick has said already, you do need to be prepared with your applications. And that really does mean downloading the software and making sure you understand by communicating before the interview with what tools are going to be used, just to get a better sense of what you need to download. I would also highly recommend, where possible, to run a test version of the software. I know developers and technology people like to fiddle with their equipment, and you may have a firewall issue, or you may be running software that may force issues when you actually come to use the software outside of downloading. So better prepare for that. The next one is, as Nick has already mentioned, with everyone shifting to home, bandwidth in your house has started to become a premium. So you might want to think about just making sure people are not streaming movies and videos. But there's some hidden things as well, and there's just some simple things you can do to avoid any issues cropping up. Maybe unplug your consoles and just pause any background downloads that may be going on with your computer. I certainly know I see changes in my bandwidth depending on what's being patched and what's driving in my household. Next is making sure that you are preparing your space that you want to interview with to try and avoid distractions. And look, the reality is that a lot of us are coping with different working environment, more people in the space than we've had before. And that just requires some delicate balance. And it's perfectly okay to set good expectations with the person you're interviewing with, that there may be things that crop up during the course of that space, but make a good effort just to make sure that you're managing the environment that you're in. And that includes the exact opposite of what Nick just said, which is don't leave stuff open, don't have Slack running, close all that stuff down so you're not getting distracted during the course of that interview. And then, while many websites recommend, kind of having a blank neutral space, I personally have interviewed and shifting to 100% remote interviewing, have actually enjoyed seeing people's environments. So if you have a clean, tidy space that you can use, actually the stuff behind you can be a really good conversation starter. And if you're like me, inquisitive when you talk to potential candidates, you can also judge a little bit about a person from the stuff they have around them. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I would avoid digital backdrops. I know in certain circumstances, Teams has the ability to blur the background. I would leave that kind of stuff off and just keep the video as simple as you can during the course of your interview. And also, when you're preparing and you're asking what software is going to be used, it's also a good time to ask what the appropriate dress code is going to be. I did a series of interviews recently for a single position, and I had everything from an individual dressed in a full suit and tie, looking very, very formal, to somebody on the other end with a logo T-shirt on. And while I didn't really mind, I think it's best to try and find a balance and make sure that you understand what the expectations are. I would definitely say in our environment right now, suit and ties are a little less common. And technology organizations have tended to be a bit more relaxed about how you present yourself, but really understanding what the expectation is will help going into that meeting. And then you need to engage in the usual prep work you do. thinking about stories that overcome challenges, writing down previous questions that may have stumped you in an interview and being prepared for that. And I can tell you from my experience, a surprising number of candidates don't actually research the company that they're interviewing with. And you can take 10, 15 minutes. There's an enormous amount of information on the internet. I like to, if you're interviewing at a public company, hop over to the SEC website where all the public filings are and just spend 15 minutes reading the latest press release or latest filings, because you can then include that research in questions you're asking. For example, asking a question, hey, I saw in a recent press release, and then concluding with something you did see you're interested about, really does show a level of research that honestly a lot of candidates just miss out on. And I personally find the more senior role you're interviewing for, the more research you really have to do. Basic stuff like knowing the names of the senior team and the leadership of an organization isn't a lot of effort, but surprisingly overlooked by a lot of candidates. And then you're going to get asked in a good interview, what questions do you have about the company or the role? And that's an area for you both to show that you've researched and understand some context for the organization, but it's also an opportunity for you to test the cultural fit potentially for an organization. And I think more than ever, this is a good chance for you to ask about what is happening and what's the response been of a company to the current COVID-19 issue. You may even, if you're talking to someone who may be your manager, make this a little bit more personal. How have you found this transition? What do you think about working from home to build that better connection, not just around the company's response, but also on a more personal level? Particularly, as Nick said, people are dealing with the change of working remotely in all sorts of different ways. So the rules really haven't changed a lot for preparing. I think you just have to be more aware of the environment that we're interviewing in, both as a candidate and as an interviewer. And part of interviewing for a technical role has been tests and assessments. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. When you get into the tests and assessments, this is definitely a space where people can get sloppy. I had an interview recently where as part of the process, we asked the candidate to show a presentation, and it was very clear from the title page that they had reused a piece of work that they had presented to another company and failed to go through and take that company's name off, which, while wasn't a major thing, really was sloppy. It was sloppy. So you need to watch that. I can also tell you, as an inquisitive interviewer myself, when you ask a candidate to share their desktop, I'm not just looking at the window that you're sharing. I'm looking at the icons that you have, what applications you've downloaded. Perhaps I'm looking at the tabs that you have open. So as best you can, just like you're cleaning the environment you're working in before an interview, I would make sure that you're cleaning your computer as well and making sure it's as presentable and it's showing you in your best light as well. The next one is that you need to rehearse. This is really just the same way you would rehearse interview questions. Test your clicks and screens. In the age of not getting up and being able to do this on a whiteboard, or being in an environment where maybe there's paper tests and people are asking you, you have the opportunity to show that you are prepared. This is also very similar to if you are doing a software demo. Treat it like that. Make sure that you're logged in so you're not having issues logging into repositories if that's where you're going to go. And make sure that your explanations are clear and concise and that you're not getting confused about what you're showing. And that really is about practice and rehearsing. And again, preparation is key. And then finally, just like the video conferencing, make sure that you are asking ahead of time if there's any particular software or apps that are required. Make sure you're downloading it and you've tested it in advance so that there aren't any hiccups as you go through that process. And then finally, and this is one that I've actually had happen to me recently with an interview, just be aware that when you are switching between various video products, sometimes the microphone and camera aren't set to the right thing. I had an incident where I could see the candidate but couldn't hear them while they were moving the software to take advantage of the microphone that they wanted to use. But I could visibly see the frustration that they were having as part of using that. So be careful of a hot mic situation, either microphone or camera. And remember, part of what you're displaying when you interview is how cool and calm and collected you are when things don't go quite to plan. Also bear in mind that interviewers themselves are managing through change themselves, and that requires you to be calm and patient with them as well. I'll be staying for the Q&A. If you have more questions, I'd like to say thank you, and I'm going to hand back to Nick to talk about onboarding.
Thanks so much, Paul. So onboarding is another tricky subject, even at the best of times. And fortunately, companies know that onboarding at this moment is even a little bit weirder than before. In fact, if you're just joining a company remotely right now, they might end up having a second in-person onboarding once everyone comes back to a physical office space, just so you know where everything is in physical space. The good thing is that recruiters and hiring managers know that good onboarding leads to solid productivity, so it's important that it goes right for both technologists and their companies. The trick to a good onboarding is to be proactive. Make sure that your manager or rep sets you up with meetings with everyone who's a stakeholder in your success, whether that's team members or managers or whoever. Many companies like Dice also have onboarding buddies who can answer questions and generally help everything along. It's important, another note to make about the onboarding buddies as well is that usually when you do a physical onboarding, you're guided around the office. You can see how teams are physically laid out. You know who to ask for questions. There may even be materials on the wall or easily available so that you can quickly get your bearings. That buddy is now going to basically take that role on themselves and digitally, hopefully, guide you through everything that you need to know. One of the keys to a successful onboarding is being as proactive as possible. Make sure you're explicit about the equipment that you need, as well as company policies on personal versus company hardware and apps. You should also figure out explicitly the schedule for VPN, software training, and so on. So these are some fun stats that we threw in. Companies may even be willing to pay for your internet and phone connections during this period, and it certainly never hurts to ask. But if you're going to be making phone calls all day, or if you're going to be building apps or conducting other activities that demand an enormous amount of bandwidth, it might be nice if your company helps you basically pay for that. And yeah. Since you're not getting that office walk around where you're introduced to everyone and shown how teams are structured, ask your manager or onboarding buddy if there's a digital equivalent, a diagram of who reports to who, team structure, or anything along those lines that can help. Some forward-thinking companies also have a digital packet of materials that provides insight into the company's history, culture, and current projects. This can help you get up to speed, since you're not exposed to office culture, but sometimes you have to explicitly ask if they have those materials available. The key to a successful onboarding is to ask early, ask often. As with so many parts of the interviewing and hiring process, not to mention your actual work life, especially these days, over-communication is key. Thank you for joining us today. There's been a lot of big changes in the past few weeks, but we can get through this. Optimism really is key. And yes, there are turbulent times out there, but the data does suggest that there's ample reason for us all to hope. Companies clearly want to hire technologists for a variety of roles, many of them mission critical. And with that, I'm going to hand things back over to John for questions.
Well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Nick, and thank you to Paul. So we have a few questions that have come in. And I please would like to remind everyone that you are able to submit yours as well with the control panel. We have gotten a few questions about whether these slides and the recording of this presentation will be available, and they will be. They will be sent out tomorrow afternoon, so you can look forward to getting that as well. So the first question that I have, I'd like to start with you, Paul, which is, will there be an influx of remote jobs even after this pandemic?
Yes, I think it's a great question, and it's something that's speculated a lot right now, both in the media and then with companies. I think that what's going to happen is we will definitely see a shift in attitude towards roles that have been viewed as in-office only, to allow more flexibility for those to be remote or work from home on a more permanent basis. However, I read an article recently that really kind of said this isn't a technology issue. We've solved some of the technology that allows people to be as productive, or even more in some cases, working remotely or at home. But there are culture and there are company dynamics at play where individuals like to go into an office, and companies like to have their employees there. So I think while it's definitely going to open up the possibility of more work from home in the future, I don't think this is the tipping point where suddenly businesses are going to run 100% remote where they haven't in the past. So I think it's starting to push us in the right direction. I think there will be more flexibility, but it's not going to be suddenly a rush to move out of real estate.
Thanks, Paul. And Nick, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I agree with Paul. I don't think that we're going to see an instant overnight transition to a completely all remote work environment. The thing that a lot of companies and teams are wrestling with now is trying to optimize the extended work from home process. And once that's completed, we may see teams that are a higher percentage of remote workers because of that optimized process. But I don't think that companies are going to be selling their physical footprint anytime soon.
Thanks, Nick. And so I have another question here, which is, are there any tips on salary negotiations amidst COVID-19? And Nick, why don't we begin with you on this one?
Sure. I think that the advice that basically stuck before with regard to salary negotiations still remains pretty much the same, even in this new and changed environment. You have to demonstrate how your skills can be leveraged for the accomplishment of the company's goals and strategy. And once you sort of prove that particular value, then, obviously that becomes the fulcrum of your particular negotiation. In addition to that, the usual earning of certifications and other demonstrations that you have the skills to lead whatever projects the company has put as its highest priority, all of that definitely still applies in this environment. So I don't think there's been a radical shift in that regard. I think everybody who had a strategy for that before can safely continue in that strategy now.
Thanks, Nick. And Paul, is there anything that you'd like to add to that as well?
Yes. So I've led technology organizations for many, many years. And one of the things that I encourage my staff to do is really work on their soft skills. And a core part of that soft skills is both relationship building, but also negotiating. One of the wonderful things that has come out of the current climate is that there are a lot of universities that are opening courses up that have not been available before. And there's awesome content from MIT and Harvard Business School on negotiating. So regardless of the position, I think what Nick said is spot on. Improving your general negotiating skills is something that is worth investing in, and you can take the time and do that right now.
Thanks, Paul. So I have another question here that is in regards to missing a coding challenge deadline. So Nick, can I start with you on this one? If there's any advice that you have on how candidates should proceed if they do miss one of those deadlines?
I think right now, companies understand that everybody is in flux, that things may be missed by a day or two, that people are trying to radically adjust to change circumstances. We've been involved in this whole COVID-19 situation for a number of weeks, and yet it still feels like very early days, for better or worse, in terms of all of this. This is one of the things, as Paul just mentioned, negotiation, or the ability to negotiate, and soft skills are always your friend in that sort of context. And if any sort of deadline is missed, whether it's a coding challenge, whether it's anything else, having a one-on-one and frank and polite and respectful conversation with whoever is managing that particular thing can often lead to a potentially good result. So if somebody missed a coding challenge, for example, because they had an abrupt problem in terms of getting their tech stack online after shifting remote, I think just a simple, clear explanation of that might be just what's necessary in order to have that deadline extended.
Thank you, Nick. And Paul, is there anything that you'd like to add to that in terms of missing a specific challenge deadline?
Yeah, I think what Nick said's dead on. The other thing I would tell you sets individuals apart in organizations isn't just explaining why you missed something once you've missed it. It's actually getting ahead of that and explaining that you will miss it, and these are the reasons why. More broadly than just missing a coding challenge deadline, it's the same with projects, it's the same with any kind of program where teams are relying on you to deliver something. Just being able to be proactive and estimate when that's going to be finished is a real skill and something that is critical if you want to progress in an organization.
Thanks, Paul. All right, and we have one more question here, which is how can I avoid scams for remote work? Nick, can we start with you on this one as well?
Sure. So the key to avoiding hiring scams and so on is always a good deal of background research. Especially if you've never heard of the company that's making the approach, it's imperative that you do as much research as possible. And fortunately, whether it's subreddits that deal with programming and hiring, or whether it's review websites, there are a lot of resources out there where you can discover the legitimacy of tech companies with relatively few clicks. In fact, forums such as Hacker News or Reddit or so on can sometimes act as early warning systems if there is a particular hiring scam that is going around. But it's imperative that you do as much research as possible before you opt to engage with whoever is reaching out to you.
Thanks, Nick. And Paul, is there anything that you'd like to add to that as well?
Yeah, just to add that, I mean, we're in a period where there is a sharp increase in both cyber criminal activity pointed at companies and individuals, and the rules apply. And it's the same thing, right? If it's too good to be true, you should be skeptical. If there's any money up front, you should be skeptical. And it really, you just have to do the research and be okay, pushing back. Some people. I'm originally from England, and there's a bit of a too polite syndrome to call people out, and I think sometimes you just have to put that aside a little bit, and if it sounds fishy, be okay pushing back.
Thanks, Paul. So I think those are all the questions that we have for now. We have a few that are a bit more specific that we would be happy to follow up with via email. But I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I also just want to echo again that we will be sending out a recording of today's webinar tomorrow afternoon, so please look forward to that. And thank you for joining us, and stay safe. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick and Paul.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.